Okay. We're going to go ahead and get started. Be making your way to your seats and things. And if we get started now, then we'll be able to stop by 20 or 25 to 11. Just a note as we're getting ready to start this morning that those bathrooms in the back, there are no lights back there. So if you need to use a restroom, use the ones over by the small auditorium. Okay? We're continuing to have electrical problems. There are new electrical problems that continue to develop, and the electricians should be in here this week to begin troubleshooting. I don't know who has the announcements before worship service, but if they could also mention that those bathrooms are not available this morning, that would be good. Thank you, Lamar. Okay. We're going to get started into John chapter 6 this morning. So we're making progress, gang. I told you before that John 5 was particularly challenging because it was one of those lengthy times when Jesus goes into all kinds of detail about different things. John 6 is no different. And actually, when I've told you that I've always been a little bit nervous about teaching our way through John 6 is one of the reasons. So over these next couple of weeks, we're in for an adventure, but it should be, I think, illuminating and valuable to us. So don't forget, here's where we are in the text at this point. We are watching things as they polarize. We saw things really getting hotter in Jerusalem the last couple 3 weeks when we were in chapter 5. Don't forget that in that chapter, we saw a paralytic who was healed, and immediately following that, Jesus received all kinds of criticism because he was, number one, violating the Sabbath in the eyes of the Jews, and then secondly, he was claiming equality with God. But then we took a look over the last 2 weeks at Jesus' response to those accusations in chapter 5. And his response began by he identified that he actually is participating with his Father. So that was the first thing that he said, was that he is participating. Oh, great, this is out too. There it goes. They're both sharing together in the work of his Father. And then he went into a lengthy discourse talking about the relationship between he and his Father. So we learned a lot about the father-son relationship. And then last week we spent our time talking about the fact that the Father has provided the testimony that backs up what Jesus has to say. And there are a lot of different ways in which God has done that. The fact that they share in their work, the signs that Jesus was able to perform were all signs that his Father was on his side and was testifying for him. The Father gave direct testimony at various times. For example, at his baptism, and we're going to see here in John chapter 12 a little later on when there's a direct response from the Father to something that Jesus, in that case, says. We talked about the fact that the Old Testament scriptures are full of prophetic passages about the coming of a Messiah and how Jesus has now fulfilled those, but of course the Jews had their blinders on and couldn't see that. And then the last area where God had testified was through Moses and the giving of the law, and how that was looking ahead to the day when he would raise up another prophet like unto Jesus, who would then lead his people. Okay, so that was what we saw last week going on down in Jerusalem. Now this week we turn to chapter 6 and we see some of that same filtering out going on in Galilee. And this one opens up, this chapter, like chapter 5, opens up with, in this case, a set of miracles. 2 different miracles happen, and they will culminate after those miracles are performed. Jesus will speak again, and he will give what's known as his bread of life discourse, where Jesus makes that claim. He says, I am the bread of life. So here is the outline for chapter 6. Verses 1 through 15, we see the first of his 2 signs. The first one is the feeding of the 5,000. And then in verses 16 through 24, we see the second of his 2 signs where Jesus walks on water. After that, verses 25 through 59 is where Jesus then launches into his monologue. Essentially, there is some discussion back and forth between he and the crowd that has gathered in the synagogue, but mostly Jesus is talking, and he explains, I am the bread of life. And we'll be spending some time on that likely next week and maybe the week after. And then the chapter 6 concludes in verses 60 through 71 with the reaction to Jesus again. And this time we're going to see a number of those who have become disciples, or at least fledgling disciples, who actually turn back and turn away from Jesus because of some of the things that Jesus challenges them with. And so today we start there with our signs by the sea, and we're going to take a look at verses 1 through 24. So I'm calling this signs by the sea because there are two different miracles performed here, and of course we've said several times that these miracles are intended to be signs for us to see God's role in this important mission. But the two miracles that we're going to be discussing are the feeding of the 5,000 and then Jesus walking on water. One of the things that you need to remember, and this goes all the way back to our introduction to the book of John. Remember how we talked about how unique all of the events are in John, and most of them show up nowhere else in the Bible. Virtually everything we've looked at so far in John is unique to John. Doesn't show up in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. That's not true for today's. Today is sort of the exception. When we read about the feeding of the 5,000, that is the only miracle that Jesus performs that's in all four Gospels. Okay? It's the only one. And then when we read about Jesus walking on the water, that also shows up in Matthew and Mark. It's not in Luke, but it's in Matthew, Mark, and then John tells the story also. But all of the other miracles of John show up only in his Gospel. Chapter 2, we saw Jesus turning water to wine. That only shows up in John. In chapter 4, when Jesus healed the official's son, only John. It's unique to John. When we looked at the healing of the paralytic in the last chapter, in chapter 5, that's unique to John. The next miracle we're going to see is going to be in chapter 9, and that's the healing of a man born blind, only in John. And then, of course, in chapter 11, when Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead, that's only found in John. So this is the exception, what we look at today, because these miracles were well known. What is important about that fact? Well, remember, when John writes his gospel, all the other gospels have already been written. So the stories about Jesus have all been circulated to the known world. They're all well known, they're all well understood. So largely, when John writes, he's writing de novo. He's writing new stuff that people have not seen and experienced before. So people are well aware of these events that have been circulated throughout the churches and the regions of the first century. But John decides to record these two things right next to each other that are well known. And so what I want for us to look for today is that, again, going back to that, what's special about these in the way John tells them? Because he doesn't intend just to say, okay, see Mark, or see Matthew, or see, he doesn't just write a footnote. He tells the story, and he says there's some unique things that show up here. And so that's what I think we need to find as we work through here, is the uniqueness. These stories are well known to you. We're not going to go through them in the same detail that we would if you didn't know these events from the life of Christ, but you know them. So we're going to hit them, but we're going to emphasize those parts of the story that are unique to John, and then try to answer at the end of this, why is it that John relates them in the way that he does, when the whole rest of the book he chooses not to duplicate what's already been written. But this stuff must have been really important in John's mind, because he wanted to emphasize it again. So let's start out with verses 1 through 15, and I'm just going to read through this quickly. Sometime after this, and that's after the events of Jerusalem in chapter 5, sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover feast was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, 8 months' wages wouldn't buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up, "Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and the men sat down, about 5,000 of them. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over, and let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the miraculous sign that Jesus did, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." And Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So here we are. We're beside the Sea of Galilee. And let's take a look first at the setting. The Sea of Galilee, I was talking to Rose on the way here this morning. I don't know why it's called a sea. I think a sea just means a place where things are held. So it could be, a jar or something like that too. But it's not. It's a big lake. It's about the largest lake in Michigan, inland lake in Michigan is Houghton Lake. Houghton Lake is the largest, and the Sea of Galilee is about twice as big as Houghton Lake. So it's nothing like the Great Lakes. Okay, it's a big lake is really what it is. And they're on the eastern shore of that big lake. In one of the towns called Bethsaida. And there actually are 2 or 3 different areas that were known as Bethsaida. Bethsaida or Bethsaida, depending on how you pronounce it, is just simply interpreted fisher town. So these are fish villages. I think there's a fish town up in the Leelanau Peninsula in Michigan. But that's what it would be. It's fish town. So that's the kind of place that we're talking about, and that's where many of these disciples have lived and made their living for years. Now, as far as that's the location, what about the timing of this? Well, it just is very vague. According to chapter 6, verse 1, John just says sometime later. So Jesus had been down in Jerusalem in chapter 5, but sometime later he has now migrated up to his home region up in Galilee, and he's been up in that area. John just does tell us, though, and this is one of those unique points of John's gospel, is that Passover's coming. Okay? And it's in chapter 6 and verse 4. And we need to keep this in mind as we work our way through this text, because there are some linkages that we're going to see. And I'm just going to mention this now. First of all, there's the setting of Passover that's coming. Passover is expectant. There's going to be a miraculous feeding that takes place, okay? And a feeding that sustains God's people. There's going to be teaching that Jesus is going to give about the bread of life, okay? And then finally, John doesn't talk about it, but we realize in retrospect that all these things come together in some form or fashion when we think of the Lord's Supper, okay? And so all these things sort of mesh together at some point. So you need to keep that in mind as we look forward. And John sort of gives us this hint as he says Passover's coming. So be ready to watch for some of these connections that we will see. Chapter 6, verse 2 says that a great crowd had gathered. Well, why were there so many of them? Because they saw the miracles. That's right. That's in verse 2. They had seen the miracles. What miracles had they seen? Healings. And John specifies that. He says, a great crowd of people followed him in verse 2 because they saw the miraculous signs he had performed on the sick. It's interesting that John says he's done a lot of miracles that people have observed, and he's attracted a great following because of his healing of the sick. But now in these two miracles, this isn't going to be about healing sick today. This is going to be something different. And so that may be another type of foreshadowing that John is giving us, is that this is going to turn out to be important because it's a different dimension of Jesus' miraculous power. It also tells us that Jesus has been in Galilee, although we don't know how long. He's been there long enough to attract quite a following. Think about the logistical challenges of getting 5,000 men, not counting the women and children, to walk or row 6, 7, 8 miles to the other side of the lake to chase him down and then come back again, because that's what we're going to see happen. So that's the kind of following Jesus has attracted. It's not just a casual group of observers, and they're very interested in what's going on. The next thing that John records for us that's unique is he says that Jesus decided to test Philip. And this is, again, something that we only read about in the Gospel of John. We don't read about it in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. Now, why does he choose Philip to test? We don't know a lot about Philip, do we? Why do you think he might have, though? Any ideas? This is going to tell me how carefully you've been listening. Well, Philip was from there. Philip was from Bethsaida. And so when Jesus says, where can we get food? It's kind of like, where's the nearest grocery? Where's the 7-Eleven? You know? And so that's the question for Philip, you know, is where can we get enough food to help these people? Philip would have had the local knowledge. But of course, the test wasn't really about that, was it? What was the test about? What was Jesus testing Philip for? His faith. In what way? Yeah. For those of you at home, the point has been made that God can provide anything, anywhere, and that's absolutely true. So the question for Philip really isn't where can we buy food, it's do you see any alternative besides your humanness? Can you find an answer here besides looking at this with your realistic colored glasses on? You know, we talk about wearing rose-colored glasses. Well, sometimes when it comes to spiritual things, we're guilty of wearing clear glasses because all we can see is what's straight and directly in front of us instead of seeing the spiritual potential and the spiritual possibilities. But not so here. Philip is one that is stuck in the reality of what's going on in front of him. And Andrew joins with the same thing. He says, here's some food, here's a little bit of food, but what good's that going to do, Jesus? You know, and so both of them are stuck in this reality-based thinking and visualizing. That's right. That's right. And spoiler alert, but what's that? And the wedding wine, sure. Spoiler alert, though, even after this miracle, they're not going to get it. So, but you and I wouldn't either, I don't think. That's absolutely. Okay, so how does Philip do on Jesus' test? Well, he flunks. Philip and then Andrew also identify themselves as realists. Now, if Jesus already knew the answer to the question, why does he ask it? Make them think. That's right. And watch this as we go through this thing, because time and time again, Jesus is going to put something out there, not for his benefit, but for their benefit, to see where they measure up and where they fall short. And so Jesus does this over and over again. That's right. That's right. The point there is that Jesus has to get these apostles and disciples in a position where they are ready to carry the torch once he has left the scene. And you know, this is something I want for you to watch in the gospel here as we go through it, because I was actually thinking about this on the way here this morning too. John is giving us an insider's view. And it will get even more so as we look particularly to the last night before Jesus' crucifixion. He gives us so much detail that's very intimate. and how Jesus is taking care of and protecting and preparing his apostles for the work that's in front of them. And it really, we can see it starting to form here, where Jesus is pushing his apostles in not a different direction than the rest of the crowd, but he's pushing them harder. That's for sure. And he's wanting them to get to that point of maturity where they're ready to carry on. Jamie?
Where they were, but he's making them think, where are you? They're hiding from God.
That's right.
They're ashamed.
Yeah, so the actions of the Father, the actions of Jesus, quite often are not intended for their benefit. They're intended for ours, even when they appear on the surface to be a question about something that they wouldn't know, because they know. They know the answer to that. It's for us that they're providing that direction. Okay, so if Jesus already knew the answer, why does he ask? Well, it's for their benefit, for their insight, for their learning. And imagine now, at the end of the day, as Philip looks back at the events of the day and thinks, oh, you know what? I told him 7-Eleven wasn't open, and here he was right in front of me the whole time. You know, and what a just a moment of recognition and insight that had to be for Philip at the end of the day. So we see in verses 8 and 9 that Andrew is also a realist, just like Philip. But another detail that John gives us is that these were barley loaves. None of the other Gospels mention that they were barley loaves. Have any of you ever had barley bread? What'd you think of it, Jerry? Okay, that's not what I read. Everything that I read says that barley loaves were sort of the lowest thing on the food chain for humans. In fact, they were often used to feed animals.
Something like sourdough bread.
Okay, all right. It must have been nicely processed, and theirs wasn't. I'm getting the impression that theirs was more like straw or hay. So it's pretty tough and really mealy and just not a good quality of food. So I think John is saying something also about the type of thing that Jesus can work with. He can take the insignificant, the stuff that most people would reject, and make it, in this case, save their lives. Okay? So that's what Jesus can do. John also uses a term that's unique to him for the fish, and the term is for small fish. It's a small fish that would be either salted or pickled down, and it would have typically been the sort of thing, like a can of sardines that men would take on the boats with them when they would be out fishing, or if they were out farming, they'd take some of these little fish that had been salted down, and that's what they would use. But John, being a fisherman himself, he uses the word for these little fish, and none of the other gospel writers use that word either. It's just kind of unique, I think. Then we come down to verse 11. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to them. Does that sound familiar to you? Jesus took the loaf, gave thanks, and distributed and gave it to them. Yeah, it should sound familiar to him because we see it in the same phrasing, almost the exact same language used in Matthew 26, Mark 14, Luke 22, and 1 Corinthians 11 in our discussions of the Lord's Supper. Mm-hmm. And it's virtually the same text. The Talmud tells us that at mealtime, Jews would offer a standard prayer, a ritual prayer, and we can pretty much guess what that prayer was. The prayer that, according to the Talmud, would have been offered was this: Blessed art thou, Jehovah our God, King of the universe, who causes bread to come forth from the earth. Now think about the setting that they're in as Jesus breaks this bread, gives it to them, and says, Blessed art thou, Jehovah our God, King of the universe, who causes bread to come forth from the earth. And the Jewish scholars divide this prayer and say that it has three critical meanings. Meaning number one is a recognition of who this all comes from. The God of heaven, the God whose name they can't even pronounce, the King of the universe. Secondly, every piece of bread that is made, that is baked, that is eaten, that's a fresh creation of God's. And that's what this prayer tells them. Blessed art thou, O God, who causes bread to come forth from the earth, to provide for our sustenance. And then the third element, of course, is one of great thankfulness and gratitude. And I think if you close your eyes and put yourself there, and you see Jesus as he's about ready to minister to this huge throng of people that has gathered, and he offers this prayer of thanksgiving to an all-powerful God who has caused a creative event to take place right in front of their very eyes. It's powerful. And then the other thing I want you to see from the text is verse 13, where there are 12 baskets of scraps, leftover bread. And you just wonder, maybe these were each of the apostles carried a basket with them. These were their baskets that they're now going to take with them and use this to support them in the rest of their ministry. It's interesting that the number 12 shows up here, but you can't write home about it. It's just an interesting thought. Verses 14 and 15, John gives us unique insight into the crowd's reaction. They saw this miracle, and then they said in verse 14, surely this is the prophet who was to come into the world. And as we talked last week, this again is referring to that passage from Deuteronomy 18, where Moses said, God will raise up from among you a prophet like me. Okay? And that was the prophet, that was the prophetic passage, the key prophetic passage that they had been looking for. So Moses had said, God will raise up a prophet like me. What is it that Jesus has just done that's just like Moses?
Well, Moses brought water through the rock.
And manna and quail from heaven. Moses sustained a whole nation for 40 years. Now, Moses didn't do it. He was God's agent, right? Same is true here. Jesus did it, but God did it. Okay? And so, there are so many parallels to Moses. And you're going to have to keep that in mind as we get into the last part of chapter 6. Because when Jesus says, I am the bread of life, that's going to be talking about him being what God has provided from heaven. Okay? Just as he did the bread. So that's where this thing's going to head. But nobody sees that at this point. Even the disciples who are there watching it don't get it. What's the crowd's intention at this point? What do they intend to do with Jesus?
They want to make it.
Man, we need you. We need you. And this, again, is another one of those unique details.
You can't blame them.
You can't blame them. But here's the interesting thing. They want Jesus to do it in the way that they want it done.
Like David.
They don't want it in Jesus's time frame. They don't want it in Jesus's direction. They don't have the goals in mind that Jesus has. They're looking for worldly domination and peace and security and independence from Rome and some sense of a physical earthly kingdom. You know, it's not saying that it wasn't spiritual. It was, but their vision of spirituality was confined to stuff that's going to happen on this earth. And we're
Like ours.
Yeah, like ours. Very often it's exactly like ours. And so this shows us another type of polarization that's taking place. Even some of those who are following Jesus are following him for the wrong reasons. And what does Jesus do? Jesus makes it clear that that's not his plan, and he retreats away from that. He gets out of it. He says, okay, I'm going to get out of here. And he goes off into the mountains by himself. And according to Matthew, Mark, or I guess just Matthew and Mark, he goes into the mountains to do what?
Pray.
To pray. He goes into the mountain to pray. And so that's the 5,000 through the eyes of John. Okay. Oops. I guess I just There we go. Scene 2, walking on water. Let's, I think we can, this one will be quicker than the first one. When evening came, his disciples went down to the lake where they got into a boat and set off across the lake for Capernaum. By now it was dark, and Jesus had not yet joined them. A strong wind was blowing and the waters grew rough. And when they had rowed 3 or 3.5 miles, they saw Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water, and they were terrified. But he said to them, "It's I, don't be afraid." And then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. The next day, the crowd that had stayed on the opposite shore of the lake realized that only one boat had been there, and that Jesus had not entered it with his disciples, but that they had gone away alone. And then some boats from Tiberias landed near the place where the people had eaten the bread after the Lord had given thanks. And once the crowd realized that neither Jesus nor his disciples were there, they got into the boats and went to Capernaum in sight of Jesus, in search of Jesus. Now it's interesting that the first miracle we see here was for a great multitude. But who sees this second miracle? Just the 12. Just his closest followers. And when we get to the next section here that I don't know if we're going to get into today, but we're going to look at this through the eyes of those 12. Because they're going to see this in a perspective, and they're going to see the feeding from a perspective that the other 5,000 didn't see it from. But Jesus puts these events next to each other for a reason. We're going to talk about that later on. But this is, in contrast to the first miracle, this is a very private miracle. Okay? We talked about that at Cana when the wedding feast was performed, and even though a lot of people enjoyed the results of the miracle, those who actually saw the miracle, it was a very small number of those. But this is even more private. This is even a smaller group, which is quite interesting. All right, so the disciples are returning to Capernaum by rowing across the Lake of Galilee, I'm going to call it. Jesus has remained behind, and it's nighttime, coming up actually into the morning hours, according to the other Gospels, and the sea is starting to kick up. What does that mean if you're on the water in the night and the wind starts coming up?
Harder to row.
It means it's harder to row, but you're in for a blinger. Storms that come up at night are not pretty storms. And when the wind starts to come up, you know it's going to happen. And it doesn't matter if you're on water or not, but especially if you're on water, that's something that these fishermen would treat with all kinds of respect, right? And so they are on their guard. They're working as hard as they possibly can to get across there, and then they're halfway across, and Jesus approaches them walking on the water. What was their reaction? They're absolutely terrified. And why?
People don't walk on water.
People don't walk on water, and that's still true. They were terrified, and they thought, sure, this has to be some ghost, some spiritual being that cannot be working in our favor. Everything is turning sour here. Everything's going bad, and now it's about to crash and burn. But this miracle culminates in Jesus' answer when Jesus says, "It is I. Don't be afraid." And according to Matthew and Mark, the storm calmed immediately. It's interesting that the event, according to Matthew, also includes Peter walking on the water briefly. But John doesn't record that. He leaves it out completely. So we're not going to touch that this morning. You can go in a lot of different directions there, but I'm going to leave it alone because it's not part of John's narrative. It's not part of the message John is trying to get across here. All right? But I do want to go over to Mark because there's one thing that shows up in Mark that we need to see as we're talking about these apostles growing in faith. Mark chapter 6, verses 51 and 52. After Jesus says, "Take courage, it is I, don't be afraid," then he climbed into the boat with them, and the wind died down. They were completely amazed, for they had not understood about the loaves. Their hearts were hardened. So miracle number one didn't hit home for this 12. Miracle number two hit home. So it's interesting to look at how their faith is growing through these experiences. And how, once again, Jesus is providing exactly what they need. And I would refer you to the end of the gospel when Thomas, remember Thomas wasn't there when Jesus first appeared to the 11. And Thomas wasn't there. And he said, I won't believe until I see it. But then the next week they are together again. And Jesus provides for Thomas exactly what he needs to believe. And the same thing happens right here where his apostles missed it, but then he gives them a redo in a totally different situation, but nonetheless it's a powerful message for them. And their faith is beginning to grow. Now back to John, there's something that happens in verse 21 that we need to mention briefly. It says, then they were willing to take him into the boat, and immediately, then they were willing to take him into the boat. What I want you to see is the word then. Then they were willing to take him into the boat. Up until that, they weren't. Jesus needed to reassure them and tell them, you're okay. Overcome this great fear. But then he goes on, and John says, and immediately the boat reached the shore where they were heading. Now, some have taken that to mean that they didn't even have to row the rest of the way, that as soon as the storm calmed, they were on shore. It doesn't have to mean that. The text leaves room and the language leaves room that it could just mean that they rowed unimpeded and got to the other shore quickly. So some people make a big deal out of that, immediately getting to the shore. It may be true, but it may not be true. We can't tell exactly from the language. The language is a little non-specific. And then in verses 22 through 24, we see the crowd leaving for Capernaum, and they are looking for Jesus. Okay.
Aaron?
Yes, sir.
It looks like the people stayed there all night. They're waiting for him.
They were there for the night. That's right. They didn't leave till the next day. Okay, I'm trying to get to the next slide. There we go. So, in summary, these are two very different miracles. The first miracle, the miracle of feeding the 5,000, is literally a miracle of creation. And Jesus is making food that didn't exist. And then the second miracle, when he walks on the water and he calms the storm, those are miracles of power. Miracles of great power. Power to fix, power to protect, power to overrule the most powerful forces these men knew. They're fishermen. The strongest force they can imagine was a storm on the water. And nonetheless, the power of the deep didn't begin to compare with the power of Jesus. These are two very different audiences. We mentioned that the feeding of 5,000, there's a huge throng, a huge crowd. At least probably 10 to 15,000 people are there. And when he walks on the water and calms the storm, it's a private group who is intended to see both events in sequence. And then we see different reactions. In the feeding of the 5,000, the crowd was ready to make him their king, but on their terms. The disciples failed to understand the real message behind it all. And then when he walks on the water and calms the storm, those same men now are utterly amazed. And this is for men who grew up in that area and whose lives were based on living off the water and understanding that these things just don't happen. Okay. So now, I think I can finish this in 5 minutes. Why are these signs chosen? And we go back to our question that we've been asking all the way along. John 20 and verse 31, where John says, these things are written that you might believe. So these things are all in here to help us show how faith develops and help to encourage our faith too. Well, why did John include these events? Number one, he is preparing them for the discussion that's going to come next week and the week after. In this case, it was the next day. But he's preparing them for the events of the next day. Recall that when we started into this, we talked about the fact that Jesus links his teachings to the actual physical things that he does. So in this case, he's going to bring bread, and he's going to claim to be the bread of life. He's going to bring light to somebody's eyes, and he's going to claim to be the light of the world. He's going to raise somebody from the dead, and he's going to claim to be the resurrection and the life. So these signs are not done in a vacuum. They are done because they illustrate what Jesus is going to teach them. But if the main reason and the only reason that this is here is to talk about the bread of life coming, then why does he include the walking on the water? He could have gotten by with just including only the feeding of the 5,000. Well, it's because there's another thing that's going on here too. And that is, we're watching faith develop. And we're seeing it in different groups, okay? We're seeing it, first of all, in the masses. The great crowds see Jesus as their pawn, and they want to use his power to accomplish their purpose. That's what they're wanting to do. And it tends to reflect our tendency to want to enlist God to help us with what I think are the most important things. We're just like them. We are just like them. We want to enlist Jesus to do what we want instead of listening to his direction and his desires for us. And Jesus takes himself away from that. He just walks away. I won't have any part in that, is what Jesus is saying. But more importantly, take a look at this sequence through the eyes of his disciples. Jesus provides tests of their faith. Not for him, but for them to see where they are. And it begins when he feeds 5,000 people, and they react concretely. We can't get enough bread to do this, Jesus. And it should remind us of some things we've seen. Remember when Nicodemus couldn't get his hands around the idea of being born again? How can you enter back into your mother's womb and be born again? No, it's these concrete eyes that we use. And we can't see the spiritual side of things. And then when he's talking with the women at the well, and the woman says, "Oh, give me this water. I won't ever have to come here and draw water again if you can do this for me." Well, that's not what Jesus was talking about at all. But we look at things with these concrete eyes, and that's all that these disciples were seeing was Jesus needs to feed us. We're all hungry, and we're going to die out here in the wilderness if he doesn't do something. And they're fixated on reality as they perceive it. They don't see the spiritual side of things. Then, after sign number 1 is completed, these disciples see the multitudes, and they see the reaction of the multitudes. They see how they want that group, the large group, wants to hijack Jesus. But they watch Jesus, and Jesus walks away from it. And there's a lesson there for these disciples who are watching him. The lesson is, that's not the direction he wants us to go. We've got to do better than that. And there's the message that's in it for these disciples. And then finally, they get their own private, personal miracle. Sign number 2, which is a private experience that is able to show them his total control over even the most powerful things that nature can throw at them. And Jesus shows his total mastery over that which they would have had the greatest and deepest respect for, the power of the sea. And so they react with absolute amazement. And I think what John is trying to get across to us as his bottom line, is that faith is something that develops and grows. It's not something that you acquire instantaneously once for all. Jesus is, through this, preparing them for their future responsibilities by providing them with exactly the signs that they need to see to do just that. And it's amazing to watch these men grow into those types of leaders that they are. And I'm sure for John, reflecting on this near the end of his life, has to be totally amazed at what's happened too. Thank you. Next week, if you have a chance to read it, take a chance to read it. Look at the Bread of Life Discourse. It's deep, it's heavy, but it's good. We'll see you next week. God's good.
All the time.
All the time.